talking about peace, which is why we organized such a relaxing and peaceful service this morning. It's everything exactly as planned. Junior church, there's nothing going to tell you it's time to go, so it's time to go. Well, don't worry, I only have about an hour and a half of material here, so I'm kidding. So, in week 2 of Advent, we're talking about peace, and I think this is a suitable entry point this morning. Being a little bit not what we expect is good, because I think, as we're going to see going through here, peace is not quite what we expect either. So, if you would, really quickly, just pray with me, and then we will get started. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for your word, for time spent together. Thank you for Gary and Lori, and for all of those out on the mission field and their willingness to go. And I just pray that you'll open our hearts this morning, speak through me your words, not mine, and open our ears to hear those. Pray all these things in your name. Amen. All right. So we all have an idea of what peace is when we hear that word, different connotations, different things that elicits. But we have an idea of what peace is. If we're looking at the definition, it is this kind of state of tranquility or quiet. I think it's hard to think about peace without also thinking about quiet. But we have different contexts that we view that in. If there's peace between nations, right? And we have that being the absence of active fighting is sometimes all that it takes to be, defined as peace. And that doesn't even have to mean that there's an alliance or cooperation. It's just we're not actively fighting. There's the actual peace and quiet, and that is, I think, best indicated by, anybody had a toddler and they've just been having a day and they finally fall asleep? Peace and quiet. We know what that looks like, right? It's the absence of some of that chaos, the absence of the noise. We have peace of mind. And when we talk about peace of mind, we're thinking about the absence of stress, the absence of internal struggle, the absence of whatever it is that you're worrying about, right? You have that moment. But all of these things, we kind of understand, even if we hope they aren't this way, we understand that they're a temporary thing, right? Anybody ever had permanent peace of mind? Okay, if you do, don't let big pharmaceutical companies find out about it. They want to know what you got figured out. Peace and quiet. Anybody have regular quiet? Anybody never have disruptive quiet? And by that I mean you are never around children. I can help that. I can help fix that for you if you have that problem. You can borrow any number of them. They can fix it immediately. And we know from history there's no permanent peace among nations, right? There's always conflict. And so there's this understood idea about peace that it doesn't go forever, that it isn't this permanent thing. And all of these things, they speak about the absence of something, right? They speak about the absence of conflict. It's why I think peace and quiet is the way when we pair those together, we pair them together on purpose. It's why we use that phrase, and it helps us to understand and think about the idea of peace, because it is the absence of those things. But we don't think about it as a thing that you have. We think of it as the state of things when you don't have some of that stuff you don't want. So I wanted to dive very briefly into a little bit of history here, because I was reading about Rome, which is relevant, obviously, for what we're talking about today. One of the methods that the Romans used to conquer and hold down the many different people groups that they conquered was through the term you've heard many times, divide and conquer, right? And this seems like a battle strategy, because if you know anything about ancient warfare, if you divide the line, obviously there's chaos and it causes rank and file to run, and that's what you need in ancient warfare to win. But it's not just a battle strategy, because they actually implemented it in the way that they governed. The things that they did to divide up peoples so that it was harder to rebel against them. That was their whole strategy, was through the proliferation of this idea of dividing up peoples, making them more easy to conquer. And so they would go as far as even conscripting citizens from people groups into their ranks, so that if you were going to rebel, you were going to kill your own people in order to do it, which obviously is going to make you more hesitant to revolt. And it's hard to deny it was pretty effective. I mean, the Romans were a long-standing empire, and they did what they did pretty well. But as an example of this, in 57 BC, Rome divided Israel into 5 smaller districts. They had been rebellious, and when that rebellion was put down, they split them into 5 smaller districts that were governed by their own councils. And this was a part of that plan to keep the Hebrew people from rebelling against Rome. In other words, that division was done to ensure the peace of Rome. I don't know that we would call that peace particularly comforting. I don't think that the Jewish people at that time felt great comfort in this particular kind of peace. This peace had an agenda that wasn't about their good. It was about the peace of Rome. I think this underscores the confusing nature of this word, right? Peace, for its own sake, it's not really enough. It's not really giving us enough information about what we're seeking, right? We want peace, but if peace simply means the absence of overt conflict, then a brutal dictator is actually a pretty good purveyor of peace, right? If you brutally crush rebellion, yeah, there's not a whole lot of conflict because that guy kills it every time it comes up. Well, things are peaceful. Are they good? Rome crushing that rebellion to create peace was not a comfort to the Jewish people. It divided them and kept them from being properly set apart and unified as God's people. A reality that had been a part of their history for a long time. They were divided a lot more than they were unified. For all intents and purposes, the people in Jesus' time and immediately before were actually living in a time of relative peace, if your definition is there isn't overt fighting, right? It's a far cry from being content with how things were going. I mean, the Romans had installed puppet governments, right? The high priests were appointed and dismissed by the king or by Roman governor. That's not ideal. It should have been, to anybody who was a true devout follower of God, an abomination to them that Rome is making this appointment. So there's peace, but not the kind of peace that's good for the Jewish people. The Bible doesn't talk about peace the way that we do. Isaiah 9:6 says, "For a child will be born for us, a son will be given to us, and the government will be on his shoulders. He will be named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace." And the word Isaiah uses here when he describes the Messiah being called Prince of Peace is shalom. And shalom definitely does mean peace, but it's a really inadequate, like so many things. You take a word, you translate it, and it just doesn't, it's not enough to say that it means this thing, right? It means more than that. And so it talks about this idea of completeness, right? There's more than just peace, because peace is just an inadequate definition. So it speaks to beyond what is absent and speaks to what is present in peace, right? Conflict is absent, war is absent in peace, but what's present? Okay, if there's no war, but there's also no justice, is that a peace that is comforting to us? Is that a good kind of peace? Going back to history, we look at peace after World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. And that was a kind of peace, but it wasn't very long because it was a punitive peace. We won't go into all of that. We're not going to do a whole history lesson here. And I didn't prepare for it, so I wouldn't do a good job. I'd have to call Melanie, and I don't think that she's interested in preaching this morning. So, but if peace isn't, if there aren't other elements there, if it's just the absence of conflict, it's not enough. And so, when Isaiah prophesied about the Prince of Peace, he wasn't talking about one who would simply end war or conflict so that we might have tranquility. Technically, Rome had already done that. They had already found a way to find that kind of peace. He was speaking about one who would complete God's work and bring about restoration. Completeness, wholeness, this idea of God's at creation. That's the kind of peace that the Jewish people were after. They weren't after this temporary flash in the pan kind of peace. Now, they still got it wrong, too. I mean, they had plenty of worldliness wrapped up in what they thought was the kind of peace they were getting as well. But this brings us to our challenging text for today, because if this is the idea that you have of who Jesus is, or of who the Messiah is, this bringer of peace, this unifier of your people out from under the boot of Rome, this view of our kingdom being brought back together to serve God in the way that we are intended, then Matthew 10 creates some confusion if you don't put it in its proper context. So I want to read in Matthew 10:32. We're going to go to 36. I'll let you. It says, "Therefore, everyone who will acknowledge me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven. But whoever denies me before others, I will also deny him before my Father in heaven. Don't assume that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household." All this from the Prince of Peace. This is confusing. If Jesus were running for a political office titled Prince of Peace, his campaign managers would have been scrambling for damage control. Shut this guy down. Don't let him use that stump speech ever again. That is not good. Not good for his image at all. The people would have been okay with parts of this message, right? The idea of no peace but a sword, this definitely would have appealed to people who really wanted to violently throw down Rome. That would have been okay with them. But this idea that it's going to pit you against family, what is this all about? Okay, so taking this out of context makes this a lot more chaotic than it is. What he's addressing in the midst of all this is helping the disciples understand where they stand. We won't go back through and do all of that. For those of you who remember, it's not been that long since we were in Matthew and covering this, but Jesus is using this passage to explain and highlight the stakes for his disciples. They may have been okay with bloodshed and the throwing down of Rome if it had meant a restoration to their kind of idea about what the world was supposed to be. But Jesus isn't asking them in this moment to mount a rebellion against Rome, which many would have been on board with, and most thought the Messiah was going to do. He's asking them to mount a rebellion against sin. And that's a harder one to fight. Rome is a lot easier. You take Rome over fighting sin any day of the week. Rome is concrete and easy to pin down, and it's not near so insidious. He asks them to follow him to death. He asks them to follow him in spite of the damage that it might do to their relationships, their careers, and their earthly bodies. R.T. France is a Bible commentator that I really appreciate, and he says it this way: "His coming was proclaimed as the dawn of peace on earth in Luke 2, and it's peace which the disciples are being sent out to offer. Peacemaking is an essential part of the good life, as Jesus talks about it in the Sermon on the Mount. But the way to peace is not the way of avoidance of conflict, and Jesus will be continuously engaged in robust controversy." That's a hard thing to think about. The way to peace is not the way of avoidance of conflict. As a people, we don't like conflict. I'm not sure that that's unique to us, but I do think that we like conflict less than some cultures have liked conflict throughout history. I'm not saying, as a person who generally is kind of a people pleaser, that being a people pleaser is always a bad thing, or that a desire to be kind or loving is problematic. But it does lend us to this willingness to just sit quietly when there are moments that we should say something. And Jesus is promising them, yeah, that's not what I'm signing you up for. If you're signing up for the easy life path where everything goes smoothly and everything is easy, that's not what this is. And I'm going to demonstrate it to you in person regularly for the rest of my ministry, as there have to have been times that the disciples were sitting aside when Jesus is calling out religious leaders going, "Shut up, don't say that. Do you know what kind of trouble you're going to get us in, Jesus?" The This is what he asks of them, though. He's not offering peace that will be easy and comfortable. His peace is about the reconciliation of a broken world with a loving God. And that means that instead of sitting at a well with a woman who goes out in the heat of the day because she is so scandalous to the community that she has no other time to go, Jesus doesn't sit quietly. He doesn't look out the window and raise his eyebrows. He doesn't talk to his friends about her. He engages with her. It means that when he encounters tax collectors who are reviled for their greed and their abuse of power and working for the very government that everyone hates, he doesn't avoid them or talk to his disciples about how awful they are. He doesn't try to build a criminal case against them to make sure that they're brought to justice. He confronts them and engages them. It means that when he walks into a temple and he sees religious leadership abusing their power to take advantage of people and enrich themselves, all while holding themselves up as an example of what a follower of God is supposed to look like, he doesn't sit idly by or feel some sense of gratefulness that at least God's name is in the conversation. He engages. And this view of peace is a whole lot less comfortable because it's active. The pursuit of peace is not just hoping that it comes at some point. It recognizes that peace comes at a cost. We like Silent Night Jesus. We like Away in a Manger Jesus. He asks us to bring gifts and sing and enjoy a perfect, peaceful, quiet night. Prince of Peace Jesus has sent us on a mission. And that mission is one of reconciliation and peace that involves confronting corruption and addressing sin directly, calling out those who misuse God's name, and never standing idly when injustice occurs. We like the idea of all those things, but being the one to actively do them, we like a whole lot less. We really like it when somebody else does it, and then we can clap for them and pat them on the back and be proud of them for their willingness to stand up. We like it. But getting in the mix ourselves is a little uncomfortable. Turns out that God's peace is not the absence of conflict because it involves a cessation of hostilities against the Creator of all things. It means restoring us to a right relationship with our Creator, not just to avoid conflict, but to experience life to the fullest in the way that God intended it for us. And our mission is to restore people to that kind of peace. And that can be intense. It can be difficult. It requires us to be willing to get into the mess. So, are we longing for peace, or are we longing to be unbothered? That was the question I couldn't get out of my mind all week as I was preparing for this. Are we longing for peace, or are we just longing to be unbothered? We just want our peace, and we really just don't care what anybody else's life is like. As long as our life is unharried and unbothered and we get to go through our routine, is that enough for us? Do we actively desire to see people won over to God, or is it more realistic to say that we just aren't active opponents to that happening? We don't want to stand in the way. We'll be happy about it if it happens, but we're not willing to put any skin in the game to go do it ourselves. We're not going to make it happen. So I want to give an example of this I was thinking about, and so just follow me here. Is there a difference between my level of involvement in a win or loss for the Park Heritage basketball team, depending on if I'm on the team or not? Is there a difference between my involvement in their winning or losing, depending on whether or not I'm on the team? Yes, Joel is nodding. Yes, there's a big difference, right? Okay. Am I involved in the win if I'm cheering from the stands? I see some confusion. Some people really want to kind of say yes. Yeah, there's momentum, right? We're going to talk about momentum and home field advantage. And okay, what if I just own a lot of Park Heritage basketball t-shirts and I wear one on game day? Am I involved? All right. Would we be interested in being involved if it meant hours of practice, disruption of schedules, the high probability of wind sprints? Who's really interested in the outcome to that degree, that they're like, yeah, sign me up, I'm still in? So I hope that the point I'm making is clear here. I think a lot of us find ourselves in this situation. We're fans of Jesus and his mission of reconciliation. We have the merch. We come on Sunday and sing the songs and enjoy the feeling that it gives us. We like being with people who are also in favor of the things that we're in favor of. We cheer together when those things happen. If our team wins, that's awesome. But Jesus doesn't ask us to come and cheer. He asks us to come and die. He lays out the stakes for us, and he aims it straight at us and says, go into the conflict. That's where I want you. And he says, in a line that has different context when you think differently about the idea of peace, blessed are the peacemakers, for they'll be called sons of God. Now, if you read that, absent of a biblical idea of peace, what you might think is, blessed are the people who don't make waves. That's definitely not what Jesus is talking about when he says, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the people who make peace at the expense of having peace themselves in the moment. Blessed are the people who are walking into the fight to drag the people out of the fight so that they might be made right with God. Without the reconciliation part, without that reconciliation to a loving God, honestly, the peaceful baby Jesus at Christmas doesn't matter very much. That's the whole reason he comes, is for that reconciliation. So if all we do is celebrate his coming and we don't work toward the reason that he came, we're missing the point. So we're going to take seriously the mission of reconciliation that you have been given. Maybe you've been on the sidelines and you need to get into the game. Have you let your love of relationships in your life stop you from speaking truth into those people who might see someone made right with God? Maybe there's friendships or just work dynamics that would be disrupted by you being willing to speak truth, but that person needs to hear it, and who else is going to tell them? It may be great for you to stay close with that person for you who is saved, and on this side of eternity, that's fine. But what kind of a friend are you if you let them go into eternity without being bold enough to speak? Jesus says sometimes that's going to blow up in your face. It's going to divide friendships and relationships and families. But he asks you to do it anyway. Maybe you're letting a desire to avoid conflict keep you quiet. I am a conflict-averse person. I am not a person who seeks out opportunities to have conflict in my life. But that makes it really easy for me to use that as an excuse to not speak out when I need to. You have the greatest truth that this world has ever known, that Jesus came to earth, lived a sinless life, died, and rose again so that you could be reunited with God. You have that truth. Please, don't keep it to yourself. Would you pray with me? Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that you would mold us into peacemakers, that you would give us boldness, that you would give us courage, that in the midst of our apprehension, in the midst of our uncertainty, that you would help us to understand that you've given us a mission, and whatever the cost is here in this life, the rewards in the next are so far outweighing those costs that we have no choice but to follow you. Pray that you would convict our hearts in those ways that we are not living to the standard that you've set for us. Pray that you would just hold us to account, that when we have those moments of hesitation, that you would just help us to step out in faith. Thank you that you love us. I thank you for this time of season when we can acknowledge that you loved us so deeply that you sent your Son. And I just pray that you won't let us hang on to that word, that you would give us the willingness to go and to share it. Pray all these things in your name.